anyway, let's get started. If you read the Auburn University press release about our brown bag presenter today, you'll know that Dr. Ann Leader's project, Florence Illuminated, Visualizing the History of Art, Architecture, and Society, is supported by a grant that she received from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Let me emphasize what an accomplishment it is to receive this grant, which is the second that Dr. Leader has received from the NEH. I'm going to quote from the NEH website. NEH grants help to bring museum exhibitions to your town, strengthen teaching in your schools, create documentaries and podcasts, facilitate groundbreaking research, and preserve and expand access to cultural and historical artifacts. In a fiscal year, the NEH will make about 900 grants over 40 grant programs. And in most programs, the applicant success rate varies from 6 to 40%. The funding ratio across all grant programs is approximately 16%. So that's thousands and thousands of applications that go in every year, and 16% on average get funded. So congratulations, Dr. Leader. Dr. Ann Leader is an art historian and an author. Since 2016, she has been a visiting fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for the Advanced Technology in the Humanities, where she is developing digital sepultuario. Crazy. All those years of taking Spanish makes me able to pronounce Italian. An interactive website that chronicles the memorial landscape of medieval and Renaissance Florence. This ongoing work was facilitated by her first NEH grant. Leader holds a art history BA from Emory University, and she earned her MA and PhD in the history of art and archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. She is the 2008-2009 Rush H. Kress Fellow at Via Tati, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies, where she completed her monograph, The Badia of Florence, Art and Observance in a Renaissance Monastery, which was published by Indiana University Press in 2012. And that's also where she began her work on the digital sepultuario. I'll get there. I'll make it sound natural one day. More recently, she edited and contributed to memorializing the middle class in medieval and Renaissance Europe, and her work has appeared in several essay collections and exhibition catalogs. Her articles and reviews can also be found in many prestigious journals. Leader's publications explore a range of topics in medieval and early modern art, architecture, urbanism, and religious tradition in Italy. She is especially interested in sacred art and architecture, specifically on how images and buildings were used by individuals and institutions for devotional practice, doctrinal instruction, propaganda, and social status. She has extensive archival experience working with medieval, Renaissance, and early modern manuscripts and other materials in various Italian archives. She founded and edited its Italian Art Society blog for 3 years and has done curatorial work for several museums. Leader has taught undergraduate and graduate art history, and most recently has been an instructor for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Auburn University, where we are more than pleased to have her. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ann Leader for her presentation, How Will They Remember Me? Tomb Reuse in Renaissance Florence.
Thank you. That was such a beautiful introduction. I'm now a little more nervous than I was, but I think it'll go okay. We're going old school today. I have a projectionist who's going to advance my slides for me because we had a little because I can't see my notes unless I'm looking at my computer. That's why. So it's actually not their fault. I just didn't print it out. So is there a little like feedback on the microphone? Does it sound that way? Okay, good. Very good. So anyway, thank you all for coming today, and let's get started. So we can go to the next slide. Maybe.
Volume and the controls for that.
That's okay. Yes, you can't be in two places at once. There we go. Perfect. All right. So this month, January, marks the 16th year that I have been conducting research on burial practices in medieval and Renaissance Florence. And it started with a seemingly simple question. How did Florentines decide where to install their tombs? Funerals, like the one shown here, in this hand-painted prayer book made in Florence in the mid-15th century, they were typically held in a person's parish church. That is, the church responsible for the pastoral care of those in the neighborhood under their jurisdiction. Many Florentines, however, chose mendicant or monastic churches for their burial, believing that the prayers of monks, friars, or nuns were the most effective to secure salvation. In all types of churches, Florentines could sponsor individualized tombs that carried their names and other identifying decoration. Today's presentation focuses specifically on tomb reuse in medieval and Renaissance Florence. Now, what do I mean by tomb reuse? And we'll have the next slide. The stone slabs in the floors of Florentine churches, like the Franciscan Friary of Santa Croce shown here, covered graves used repeatedly by multiple generations of the same family. If a family died out, or heirs could no longer or had no interest in paying for its upkeep, rights to use the graves could be sold to new patrons who wanted to decorate and use them for their own burials and those of their descendants. Church officials kept track of who had rights to which tombs in registers known as sepultuari, and we'll have the next slide, and everyone can learn how to pronounce it. A sepultuario, based on the Italian word sepultura, meaning burial or tomb, is a list of chapels, altars, and tombs found in a church, cloister, or other space used as a cemetery. Individual institutions compiled these lists to keep track of who had rights to burial monuments and altars on their property, like the churches of Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella. And you see, this is a really great sepultuario because part of it is dated 1298 and the rest is dated 1439. So it's a really rare early sepultuario, and it's for the Church of Santa Croce. Santa Maria Novella also had its own sepultuario. The original still exists, but I still haven't managed to get to the archive of Santa Maria Novella to look at it. But this is a really wonderful copy that exists in the Archivio di Stato that was made about 150 years later. And it was very common for these lists to be copied and recopied. There are numerous copies of the 1439 Santa Croce sepultuario. So anyway, the individual churches would make these records to keep track, and sometimes you'll see an erasure or you'll see an addendum where this tomb was conceded to so-and-so, or this tomb doesn't have anybody in it right now. But starting in the late 16th, but really in the 17th centuries, antiquarians transcribed and expanded these registers in multi-church collections to include not only the record of ownership, but also a description of the tombs of parents, including their inscriptions and coats of arms. The best known, which you see 2 pages of on the right, and most extensive, is the Sepultuario Fiorentino, compiled by Stefano di Francesco Rosselli between 1650 and 1657. These unpublished, handwritten tomb registers record the thousands of tomb monuments that were installed in Florence's churches, and they form the basis of my research project. Next slide, please, which you heard so beautifully introduced. The digital sepultuario. And this is a website dedicated to a systematic analysis of all tombs and other memorials installed in the Italian city of Florence between the mid-13th and late 18th centuries. And as you heard, this work has been funded in part by federal grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Democracy demands wisdom. This online research portal, the homepage of which you see here, is available to anyone with an internet connection. Digital Sepultuario aims to offer students, scholars, and the public a free online resource, primarily in English, but also including transcriptions in Italian and Latin, for the study of commemorative culture in medieval, Renaissance, and early modern Europe through the history of Florentine practice. And Florence has long been recognized as one of the best places to study European history because it has an unmatched trove of archival material. It seems that the Florentines never threw anything away, and they were major bankers and cloth merchants. And so we have really rich accounting books from them. Families also kept personal diaries, keeping track of everything that they felt was worthy of writing down for their descendants to read and add to. And every church had its own archive or set of books, I should say. It's now become an archive. So even though many people like to poo-poo Florence because, oh, it's been done, you should do something else, there really isn't anywhere else where you can do the kind of archival research that you can in Florence. So I will have the next slide. Great. In addition to continuing work on digital sepultuario, because alas, it's not finished yet, we estimate that we'll get about 6,000 tombs in it when we're done, and I think we're around 5,300 right now. So in addition to continuing this work on digital sepultuario, the project is part of a multi-project initiative to link my work to that of other scholars working on Florence during the same period, on many of the same people, places, and objects that appear in digital sepultuario. This work, which is entitled Florence Illuminated, Visualizing the History of Art, Architecture, and Society, is organized through the University of Chicago, and like Digital Sepultuario, has been funded by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, though currently we are under the same freeze on payments that all federal workers have been grappling with since Monday afternoon. We hope that all will be resolved soon and that the $350,000 allocated to our project will begin flowing without further delay. Next slide, please. With the digital sepultuario, I have taken manuscript pages like these and translated them into quantifiable, searchable data, next slide, like this. Through this work, I am exploring the questions, next slide. How did Florentines decide on their final resting places? What led them to their choices about placement, form, and decoration? Next slide. Looking at Florence's tombs broadly brings us closer to understanding how early modern Europeans experienced the deaths and memories of their family members, friends, competitors, and forebears. Florentine churches were filled with tomb markers and other commemorative decorations. Next slide. For pre-modern Florentines, as throughout Europe, death was frequent and almost always happened at home, as shown in this hand-painted illustration from a Dutch prayer book, where female relatives were responsible for washing and dressing the deceased prior to burial. You see here a dying man in his bed, attended by women who comfort him and offer prayers. A doctor stands behind them at the left, analyzing his patient's urine, while other visitors come to pay respects at the right. In the foreground, we see a woman and a man, likely a friar and a nun, praying and reading religious texts to ensure that the dying man is well cared for in his transition from life to death. Next slide. Corpses were carried through the streets to churches by professional gravediggers, accompanied by family members on an almost daily basis, as you see here in a detail from a painting showing a burial in Florence near the cathedral. And this was painted around 1515, but we know from documentary evidence that this is the way they did it for hundreds of years before that. Next slide. Tombs were highly visible in neighborhood churches, and memorial masses could be heard pretty much every day. In fact, I would say every day, if you went to a church, there would be at least one memorial mass going on. Next slide. Proper burial and memorial masses were seen as necessary to bodily resurrection and entry into heaven, like you see in this choir book that shows a page illustrated for the Feast of All Souls on November 2nd. We see naked humans being resurrected in the flesh at the bottom, and some being greeted by angels, given some clothes, and sent on their way to the gates of paradise. The flames and sad expressions on some of the resurrected let us know that not all of them will gain entry to heaven. Hence, the need for a proper burial and intercessory prayers by church and lay people alike. What often comes as a surprise to American audiences is the practice of establishing a family tomb that would be used and reused for generations. And I first became interested in this topic of tomb reuse when I was undertaking research on the family tomb of the father of Renaissance artist and engineer, Leonardo da Vinci. And you can go to the next slide. Great. That I published in Renaissance Studies that you see the cover of here in 2017. This article recounts how 21 of the artist's relatives were buried in a single family tomb set up by his father, the notary Ser Piero da Vinci. Next slide. And this tomb was next to the monks' choir in the Benedictine Abbey Church of Florence. And you can advance again, which is right about where that star is. Oops, go back, please. Perfect. The church was gut renovated in the 17th century, and here I show you a convincing reconstruction of the church as it appeared when Ser Piero installed his family tomb. The tomb's inscription named Ser Piero and the date of its installation in 1474. It also indicated that the grave was intended for his family and his descendants. Next slide. Great. And now we're going to come to the part of the presentation where it would be really good if I was clicking it myself because there's going to be lots of little things coming, but bear with us and we'll get everything shown to you. So yes. So this is a 17th century tomb registry or sepultuario that is where we get the earliest information about Ser Piero's tomb. And it is now lost, but we know that its inscription read, and if you could click the slide, perfect. The tomb, and that is abbreviated by this SEP for sepulchrum of Piero di Antonio di Ser Piero da Vinci, and that's his name here. It's again also illustrated. Ser was the title that notaries were entitled to, and so Ser Piero Antonio di Ser Pietro da Vinci et Suorum. And Vinci is actually where they were from. The town of Vinci is east of Florence, between Florence and the coast. And it really wasn't a last name until they started using it or probably late 1500s, early 1600s as a last name. But it's really a toponym, just telling us where they came from. And it's quite typical for a tomb owner to include not only his name, but that of his father and his grandfather. All right. And the last pieces of this, so the tomb of Ser Piero Antonio da Vinci et Suorum, and of his own, in the year of the Lord, Anno Domini, 1474. So this formulation in the inscription and the abbreviations that you see are quite typical, and many Florentine monuments are known to have been dedicated to a single patriarch by name, with his relations honored generically. And so we can go forward. Again, great. For example, on the left, you see the tomb of the Florentine lawyer Rosso di Andreozzo Giovanni, who installed a tomb in the Badia's church in 1427 for himself and his sons. And you can press the button, which is abbreviated FIL for filiorum, of his sons. And this is actually probably what the marker on Ser Piero da Vinci's tomb looked like, going around what's called a chiusino. And hopefully everybody can see that there are two marks here. Those are actually metal hooks, and that's where you lift, chiusino translates as manhole in English, and you lift that, and that's how you're able to have successive burials in the same grave. And then while a lot of times you'll see dates using Roman numerals, you will sometimes see them in Arabic numerals as well. You can click the next. Great. Another example is, and these are both from the Badia as well. In the mid-14th century, Paolo di Ceni Covoni dedicated his monument more broadly to himself, so here's his name, and his descendants, Descendentium. Next slide. Or in the case of Ser Piero da Vinci, he has the broadest one of all, identifying that it is for himself et suorum, and his own. While these inscriptions make clear that their tombs were intended for repeated burials, they give little sense as to how many family members were laid to rest under the slabs they adorned. And you can click again. Great. Oh, yeah. Coats of arms identify the family as a whole, and together with the inscription, encourage staff and passers-by to pray for the tomb's honoree by name and his entire lineage in perpetuity. even if some or many descendants chose burial elsewhere, as was the case for Ser Piero da Vinci, whose two eldest sons, the artist Leonardo and his half-brother Antonio, did not use the family tomb. And we can go to the next. And I'll just say that you can see there's just the year, there's no month and date. And so we know that that must mean that Ser Piero installed this himself and saw to it what it said. And then we know from other documents that he didn't die until 1504. So it was actually there for quite some time and had a number of family burials, mostly children. But its impetus was Ser Piero's second wife died, no, third wife, second wife died in 1474. That's the date here. But interestingly, her name is not on the tomb, even though she's buried underneath it. So we can go to the next. Great. That tombs were believed to be powerful motivators for prayer is attested by the thousands of personalized graves installed across the city in parish, monastic, and mendicant churches, like the parish church of Santi Apostoli that you see here on the left, or the much larger Franciscan church of Santa Croce on the right, where we can see views of the central aisle of each church lined with floor slabs. The wear and tear on surviving monuments, often to the point of illegibility, attest to the many women and men who have walked over these monuments since their installation. Their placement in the pavements of neighborhood churches ensured frequent interactions with churchgoers, and the reuse of family tombs for generations assured frequent visits by kinfolk as each new family member was laid to rest. The later 16th century saw a flurry of commissions to refresh or replace worn family tombs. Next slide. In fact, it was not until the late 18th century that burials of Florentines were moved to a common city cemetery on the outskirts of town. At first, for those who died in the city hospital, unknown or without family to claim them. And on the top of this slide, you see a ground plan of the cemetery as first designed in 1765. There's a key on the left that identifies the parts. And the main thing I want you to focus on is this grassy expanse with pathways meeting in the middle, where there was a large cross mounted on a podium. And these little squares going around the perimeter, those are the common tombs that would be used. And there was a lot of concern about health in the 18th century. There was a great belief that bad vapors could make you sick. And so they didn't want burials in churches anymore. They thought it was unsanitary. This was part of Enlightenment reforms being done all across Europe. And so the Duke at the time, Pietro Leopoldo, asked for a design for a cemetery. And so what's really clever about this is that each tomb, they would start, I don't know, with this one, and it would be opened on a day where a burial or multiple burials were taking place. You would bury the deceased, close it up, and then the next day or the next time you needed to bury someone, they would go to the next tomb. And so that meant that each tomb would be closed for quite some time before it was reopened again to take more cadavers. And when the tombs became too full of bones to do any more burial, they would remove those and place them in ossuaries. So that's how the new cemeteries worked. And in 1784, a city law banned burial within the city. And the cemetery was remodeled and renovated several times to accommodate the growing number of people who were using the tomb. And the two bottom slides show kind of what the cemetery looks like now. And it stopped being used right at the end of the 19th century. So even though there were these numerous government attempts to end the practice of church burial, it did actually continue well into the 19th century. And if you go to a Florentine church today, chances are you won't see many from the period I'm talking about, but you are very likely to see them with the dates like 1891. I don't know what the oldest one I've seen is, but end of the 19th century, I would say they like finally stopped it altogether. Although I think if you're really special, you still might be able to get a marker in a contemporary, in an old Florentine church, but they're not going to bury you there. So we'll go to the next slide. So my research has shown that a large number of Florentines installed family tombs for themselves and their descendants, starting in the late 1200s and continuing through the first decades of the 1300s to about 1330. They started with outdoor church cemeteries, cloisters, and crypts, but quickly moved inside the churches as well with greater and greater frequency. This tomb boom, as we might call it, finds reference in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, which the celebrated Florentine poet finished in 1320 while living in exile. Dante's poetic vision of the afterlife unsurprisingly mentions tombs, including those with effigies, as seen in the nave and transept of Santa Croce. And you can click. Great. So there's just a few of them. In the second book of Dante's trilogy, the Purgatory or Purgatorio, a passage speaks directly to the memorial function of church tombs. And we'll take the next slide. Here you see an illustrated manuscript copy of Dante's text made in the later 14th century, perhaps in Genoa. The Roman poet Virgil, dressed in red, guides Dante, wearing blue, through purgatory, exhorting him to humility by pointing out negative exemplars of pride, which Dante describes, and this artist portrays, as a series of carved figures in the pavement. And you can click. Great. Using the Hollander verse translation of the Purgatory, chapter 12, verses 13 to 15, we hear Virgil say to Dante, "Cast down your eyes, it will be good for you and calm you on your way to look down at the bed beneath your feet." In the next 6 lines, which are verses 16 to 21, and we can go to the next slide. Great. It starts, so we have the quote from Virgil, and then Dante is the one explaining this next quote to the reader. Come perché di lor memoria sia. As gravestones set above the buried dead bear witness to what they once were, their carven images recalling them to mind, making us grieve with frequent tears when recollection pricks and spurs the faithful heart with memories. This metaphor of memory prodding the pious to remember the dead, just like a knight pricks his horse with his spur-clad heels, likely alludes to the stone effigies of knights shown in eternal repose in their armor and golden spurs, which Dante would have seen in various Italian churches. And we can go to the next. Like this spur-wearing effigy, and you see his spurs close up at the bottom. This honors the knight Messer Biordo Ubertini and is found in Santa Croce's transept. Or Messer Filippo Magalotti, who installed his church in the tomb of San Firenze, but it's now only known through this drawing on the right. Next slide. And Dante's identification of tombs as spurs to memory finds an echo less than a decade later in another poem recorded in 1327 by the Florentine grain merchant Domenico Lenzi in his diary. The words seem to plead with churchgoers not to overlook floor tombs, and it reads, quote, "O you who enter the beautiful cemetery," as tomb-filled churches and crypts were often called, and we'll have the next slide. "Looking at the paintings with delight." Next. "Lower your eyes to the dead figures below." Next. "In the tombs of the excavated ground." Next. "And remember that which they were and that which you will become." Great. We'll go to the next slide. So this poetic memento mori, which is Latin for remember that you shall die, finds a parallel in the physical memento mori provided by tomb slabs, like the one in the south aisle of Santa Croce, dedicated to Ludovico di Jacopo di Zanobi Schiattesi and his descendants. And we can click, and you see there his last name, De Schiattensibus in Latin, and click again, and the reference to all of his family et suorum, indicating the legal rights for this tomb. Both the poem and the tomb bear witness to the concerns of Christians like Lenzi that they be prepared for death, have a relatively short and pain or easy time in purgatory, and then be ready for the final judgment and hoped for entry into paradise. It can be very difficult for modern audiences to comprehend the single-family serial-use tomb in the floor of a church. It is all too easy to allied the monuments we see in the floors of Italian churches with the single-use graves of the modern cemetery. And we can click again. Where each tombstone marks the burial of one or two bodies as couples and singles are laid to rest, seemingly forever, in a park-like setting, often far from home. And this is the tomb of one pair of my great-grandparents, was in Chicago, and I've only been to it once. And I know that many of my family members have never been there. So again, very different from the Schiattesi tomb, which to this day is being walked over, and some people take the time to stop and read it. And this slippage is really understandable because even though they are in the minority, and we can have the next slide, single dedication tombs are the best known and most deeply studied because, like this splendid wall monument that you see in full view and detail to Carlo Marsuppini at Santa Croce, they frequently include portrait sculpture in the form of the deceased lying on a funeral bier, resting peacefully in anticipation of the Last Judgment. Single dedication tombs have also attracted sustained attention because many are known or thought to be by particular artists, as in the case of Desiderio da Settignano, who created Marsuppini's tomb in the later 1450s. Furthermore, much of what we know about medieval and Renaissance burial practices comes from the vast and ever-growing literature on English, French, and other Northern European memorials. And we can have the next slide. In Europe, north of the Alps, burial tended to be in parish graveyards, representations of which you see here in this French prayer book from the turn of the 16th century. And note in the left image, we see this gentleman standing on what looks to be a tomb slab. There's some bones scattered around. Here's an ossuary holding a number of skulls. And as it happens, death comes for everyone. And so it's his turn, and you can see he's not super happy about that. And then here we have, again, a cloister that's being used as a cemetery. We have men and women praying and looking on, and again, another representation of an ossuary. So these cemeteries had common graves. You would be buried for a time, and then your bones would be removed to an ossuary to, again, make room for new burials. And you can click, and there's just a close-up of those skulls. And what's interesting is that these types of places became a memento mori in themselves. And at least in the hospital of Florence, Santa Maria Nuova, which is still the hospital today, I hope you've never had to go there, but it is still the hospital. There are accounts that their graveyard that had bones lining the walls, because again, at a hospital, you're frequently having to bury and make room. So this 17th century writer says that parents used to take their children to the cemetery of Santa Maria Nuova Hospital and say, look, children, this is what's going to happen to all of us. And that sounds like a really fun Sunday afternoon to me. But that was one of the purposes of displaying them, not only so these people wouldn't be completely forgotten and they wouldn't completely have their burial be disrupted, but it becomes a giant memento mori itself. Now, when burials are inside of churches in Northern Europe, and we can go to the next slide, they tended to belong to elites who established personalized monuments to themselves alone, as in this tomb to John FitzAlan at Arundel Castle in West Sussex, England. And here you see him wearing his armor with his hands clasped in prayer for eternity, but underneath is an image of his cadaver, again, a reminder of what will take place. And this type of tomb is somewhat common in England and France, but I've never seen one like this in Italy. So again, single burial tombs in the north, quite common. Next slide, please. The most you're going to have maybe is a husband and wife. And here is a tomb from a Dutch church that only survives in a fragment. But you can see both the husband and wife have been incised into the surface of the stone. So it's not a relief sculpture, but this is pretty smooth on the floor. Next slide, please. And effigy tombs do exist in Florence, but they are the exception rather than the norm, as the examples I opened with attest. In Florence, most tombs were in fact dedicated to the family group. Next slide. Much more private and personalized than a common grave or burial ground, but more crowded than the tomb of a monarch or high-ranking ecclesiastic. It is the heraldic floor slab, rather than the effigy, that was the most common tomb type. And these could be large or small stones. Next slide. that were decorated with coats of arms, inscriptions, and sometimes highly decorated or highly decorative patterns or motifs like the Schiattesi and Giovanni tombs I've already shown you. Or these examples, next slide, from Santa Maria Novella and Santa Croce. In his influential 1994 article on tomb typologies in Renaissance Florence, the art historian Andrew Butterfield noticed that tombs like these were, quote, meant to house the remains of several members of the same clan and were made for a broader cross-section of society than the rarer portrait effigy tombs. While these observations are mostly true, family tombs typically held many more than several people. Next slide. Butterfield found, yes, most floor slabs with effigies to honor high-ranking church officials, knights or aristocrats, doctors of law or medicine, and people buried at public expense for their service to the city. In describing the dress of these portraits and contents of their laudatory inscriptions, Butterfield uses the singular, creating another point of contrast to the more common heraldic slab meant for family groups. He made the same contrast for wall tombs. Next slide. Noting that the chest on column or chest under canopy constructions like these that you see on the left of Santa Maria Novella were, quote, family tombs, while wall monuments with sculpted effigies like the Marsupini were, quote, always constructed in honor of an individual as opposed to a family. As with all taxonomies, Butterfield's categories and conclusions are very helpful, but as he noted himself, they do not tell the whole story. He hoped his essay, which he saw as a first attempt to categorize and analyze Florentine tombs, would be an inspiration for a larger, more comprehensive book study, but such a book remains to be written. Next slide, please. But he did inspire me to develop Digital Sepultuario, and I was using it just this morning to put the finishing touches on this talk. Butterfield's 1994 article, alas, never was expanded into a book, but it was republished in 2000. And so it's found a wide audience of readers and continues to be cited in new publications. And his categories and conclusions make a lot of sense. Next slide. When we come upon a sculpted reclining figure, whether incised, in relief, or in the round, it's easy to assume that the person represented lying on his or her funeral bier, and only that person is buried in the tomb. In this case, we see the effigy of the merchant Filippo di Ser Giovanni Pandolfini, whose tomb was installed in January 1384, according to the modern calendar, 1383 in the old-style Florentine calendar, whose new year began on the Feast of the Annunciation on March 25th. This tomb was placed in the Badia Fiorentina, the same monastic church where Ser Piero da Vinci established his tomb almost a century later. In another often cited, twice published article, the art historian Geraldine Johnson, next slide, used the term activated to describe how a tomb like this would work in everyday life. Here we see the effigy of Bishop Giovanni Pecci, and she said that by placing his tomb at the foot of the high altar with his feet facing the altar, every time the clergy would celebrate Mass at the high altar of Siena Cathedral, where this tomb is installed, overlooking Pecci's tomb, it's a reenactment in some ways of his funeral and thus can evoke an intercessory Mass for his soul. Next, click. Great. Now, as a high-ranking ecclesiastic, Pecci indeed would have had a tomb for himself and himself alone, and thus fits Butterfield's model. However, some effigy tombs are known to have received more burials than that of the person represented. A better understanding of how effigy tombs could also serve as single-family serial-use burial plots can further activate the effigy, with each successive burial an opportunity to remember and pray for the patriarch depicted on the tomb. Thanks to a Book of the Dead kept by the Benedictine monks at the Badia, we can be very specific about just how active some effigy tombs could be. And we'll take the next slide. So as I said, oh, and one more. Oh, no, yes. No, sorry, I want to go back. Sorry. In January 1384, as I said, a marble slab carrying an effigy that you see on the right was placed at the foot of the stairs before the Badia's high altar, much in the same way that Pecci's bronze tomb would be set by Donatello several decades later in Siena Cathedral. Now we go. Excellent. The Badia effigy was commissioned, as I said, by the silk merchant Filippo di Ser Giovanni Pandolfini, not a social category included by Butterfield in his list of the types of men who had the honor of an effigy. Now, Pandolfini did also serve as a magistrate, but as we shall see, the city did not set up this tomb in his honor. He did so himself. And you can click, great. So the coats of arms are now abraded, but this would have been one way to represent the family. And click again, please. And then the inscription, which wraps around the perimeter of the tomb in Gothic style script, typical of the 14th and early 15th centuries, frames his figure. Now, my primary source for the activity that took place around and under Filippo's slab is that Book of the Dead I mentioned, and you can click, which you see the cover and the opening page of here. And this records all burials that took place in the church from May of 1499 through the 1700s, I think, are the latest ones. So this Libro dei Defunti, or Book of the Dead, has an entry for the Pandolfini family, listing all the people who were buried there between 1499 and 1663, and then burials for that family afterwards. And so I have gone through them and learned a lot about what was happening with this tomb. Next slide, please. So Filippo secured a prime spot for his memorial at the foot of the high altar stairs, marked here with a red star. The original altarpiece by Giotto, credited as one of the fathers of Italian Renaissance painting, next slide, would have looked out over Filippo lying in repose, awaiting the final judgment. While the portrait on the tomb makes clear that it was intended for Filippo, next slide, the inscription indicates that the grave was not only for him, but also for his descendants. So we'll just go through it and you can click. So on the top of the slab, it says 1383 in the, month of January, this sepulchre was made for Filippo di Ser, Giovanni Pandolfini, and for his descendants. Pandolfini, for almost 3 centuries, Pandolfini women and men were buried under their forefathers' slab until 1663, when the church floor was redone and the tomb marker was removed to the later built Pandolfini family chapel overlooking the monastery's cemetery. The singularity of the tomb's portrait effigy masks the repeated use of this gravesite and raises interesting questions about what it meant to be a tomb honoree in the Renaissance, who was remembered and how. Next slide. So Pandolfini, next slide, great. Like the other effigies that we've seen, he's shown as if lying on his funeral bier, his head resting on a tasseled cushion, his hands crossed right over left, peacefully at his abdomen. Though heavily worn down by years of foot traffic, Filippo appears to be dressed as he would have been in life in 1384 and also at his funeral. As a silk merchant, he surely would have taken care to instruct the sculptor how to dress him. His ample cloak, which is bunched up under his hands to show its weight and length, and therefore its cost, seems to be the unbelted mantle or cioppa worn by Florentine civilians. His simple hood, tucked behind his ears, may be a cuffia, a product regulated by the Silk Guild. As a member of the Silk Guild, or Arte della Seta, Filippo held several posts in the Florentine government. 2 years to the month before installing his tomb, Filippo was elected to the priorate, the city's highest governing body. By that time, he had also served as ambassador to Bologna and Naples, and he would be elected to the City War Council, the councils of the 12 and the 16, and twice as standard bearer of justice, which was the city's highest office. So the priorate, which is the highest magistracy, had 8 members, plus a standard bearer of justice, and Filippo held this twice. Now, some esteemed citizens did indeed have memorials put up in their honor, sometimes at a significant remove from their deaths. But it was clearly Filippo who installed this tomb, for he would not die for almost 2 decades after the monument was prepared, and he was buried only on May 29, 1401, according to family chronicles, at the age of 100. Now, whether or not this is true, we know that he certainly saw at least 8 decades, surviving the Black Death of 1348, which decimated Florence and the rest of Western Europe, but pestilence that returned in the 1360s and 70s, and he had just come through the plague of 1383, which possibly inspired him to commission a tomb slab and install it in January 1384. Why he chose to have an effigy is a little harder to postulate. We can go to the next. So there are two important catalogs of tombs that survive in Santa Croce, which has the best preserved and largest corpus of tomb slabs in Florence, confirm that effigy portraits were relatively rare. Of a sample of 120 slabs installed at Santa Croce between the mid-14th and late 16th centuries, two of which you see here on the right, less than a quarter had figural decorations. So like 22.5% would have an effigy, and the others would be that heraldic type that I've showed you. Next, if we look only at those tombs that were installed before the year of Pandolfini's death, that ratio drops by a little over 3%, with only 6 of 32 tombs carrying an effigy, or a little under 19% of the total. Next slide. We can see that Pandolfini's tomb shares many formal characteristics with other effigy tombs from the late 14th and early 15th centuries, as seen in the various examples from Santa Croce that I've already shown you, and this wonderful slab from the Church of San Lorenzo on the far right that honors a musician, and you can see him holding a little portable organ in his hands. So very similar formally, but one very interesting difference is that Pandolfini's inscription is in Italian rather than the usual Latin. Why he chose Italian remains a mystery, but it may have been to make an emphasis on his Florentine identity by using the Florentine vernacular, or everyday spoken language, which was first used for literature by Dante in his great Divine Comedy. As Filippo's family were recent immigrants to the city from the hamlet of Signa, about a 3-hour walk to the west of Florence, sometime before 1295, and in fact, Filippo may have been the first son born in the city of Florence. With this recent arrival, it's not surprising that Pandolfini might want to show off his Florentinitas. And it was his father, the notary Ser Giovanni, who had brought the family to Florence. And our first documented notice of him working as a notary in the city comes from 1295. And Filippo could have been born anywhere between 1301 and 1330. So again, would have been born in Florence, but whether one of his brothers was born first, I cannot say. So, because of this recent arrival, the Pandolfini, again, whose name is right here, they didn't even actually use this family last name until well into the 15th century. So when he installed this, they weren't being called the Pandolfini. They would have been called by their first name and their father's name. So installed very proudly on this tomb, again, maybe saying, hey, we are a family with a history and a last name, but they couldn't compete with the status and prestige of Florence's oldest families, like the Albizzi, Bondelmonti, Corsini, Peruzzi, Alberti, and a name I know you'll recognize, the Medici. So the late 15th century historian, Piero Guicciardini, placed the Pandolfini in what he called the middling upper class stratum of society that he described as, quote, not yet noble, but still not completely ignoble. In fact, the language of Dante had been heard aloud at the Badia less than a decade prior to the installation of Pandolfini's monument, when Giovanni Boccaccio, the great writer to succeed Dante, read and commented on Dante's Divine Comedy in the Badia's chapel of Santo Stefano. Boccaccio, who also wrote a great work in the vernacular with his Decameron, gave 55 lectures between October 1373 and his death in December 1375. And so he probably would have read some passages of Dante and then talked about it. And I can't imagine that he would have switched to Latin to talk, because they really weren't speaking Latin except in the church. So anyway, you would have heard a lot of vernacular in the chapel not too far from where Filippo would put his tomb. And it seems really likely that Filippo would have gone to some or all of these lectures because he only lived 1 block east of the Badia, and his son became a very famous humanist, so very interested in learning. So I find it very likely that Pandolfini family members would have been in the audience, and again, maybe this inspired the use of Italian. So next slide. We know from the Badia's Book of the Dead and the 1614 Sepultuario that the tomb was at the foot of the presbytery, as I mentioned. More than likely, it was oriented with his head facing west, and you can click again, so we'll turn him around, with his feet pointing towards the high altar and Giotto's altarpiece, so that at the resurrection, Filippo could sit up and face the altar. From this vantage point, we can see that it becomes very easy to read his name. And you can click. There's Filippo, which his left foot points to very nicely. And the surname Pandolfini, next click, great, becomes more legible at the right of his cloak. And this is the view that all but the abbot and other clergy would see. So everybody would be looking at him, upside down. It's also interesting to note, and you can click again, that lay visitors coming to the church would enter through the north. There was a doorway in the north wall. And so they would approach that direction, which is the best view from which to see the Pandolfini family name. So based on my research into Ser Piero da Vinci's tomb, it is certain that Filippo's was used for Pandolfini burials as soon as it was installed in January of 1384. And we can go to the next. Great. In addition to Filippo's own funeral in May of 1401, his wife, Dora Boscoli, would certainly have been buried in the tomb if she had died in or after 1384. And maybe like Ser Piero, it was her death to prompt Filippo to install it. I haven't yet found any death records for her. We can have another click. Great. That the tomb was active during the 15th century is attested by a record indicating that by the end of the century, it had become full of bones. The Badia's Book of Record, the Book of Dead, records that, quote, on the 2nd of July, 1520, Francesco di Pierfilippo Pandolfini passed away from this life and was placed in a tomb behind the altar of the crucifix above his father Pierfilippo, who had not entered the family tomb because it was full. And you can click again. Oh, it's so tiny. But anyway, the red star there is showing you the chapel where this Francesco di Pierfilippo and his father Pierfilippo had been buried. So the tomb where Pierfilippo was laid to rest on September 5th, 1497, was in the chapel adjacent to the high altar on its north side. And this is a very prestigious place to be buried, but it's not his family tomb, which he surely requested in his will. Oh, I'm sorry. And also the way it's written in the Book of the Dead suggests that that was where he wanted to be buried. I guess they opened it and was full of bones. Why they didn't take the bones out? I mean, I guess that takes a while. I don't know, but they buried him instead in this chapel. And I don't really know much about how often tombs would be emptied out. That's something that I still puzzle over. So Francesco, honoring his father, requested to be buried in this communal tomb with him rather than take his rightful place in the Pandolfini grave with his ancestors in line with the high altar. In all, more than 100 descendants found their final rest under a tomb slab bearing the portrait of their ancestor Filippo, averaging a burial per year. I have identified 119 Pandolfini family members as securely or likely buried in front of the choir, and there were likely more burials between the tomb's completion in 1384 and the start of the Book of the Dead on May 2nd, 1499, a number that could be confirmed if I went page by page through the burial records kept by city officials, but that is actually, well, it will be easier to do because part of our project with a different grant that we got from the Lounsbury Foundation, this wonderful archivist in Italy is transcribing all of the Books of the Dead maybe while I speak. And so that'll all be machine readable and I'll just be able to do a search for the name Pandolfini and then I'll be able to get an accurate total of how many were buried there. So next slide and last slide. While Pandolfini's effigy tomb seems extraordinary for its early date in the late Trecento, its Italian inscription, and its longevity of use, it is far from unique. Next. In fact, an effigy honoring the lawyer Tommaso Salvetti was installed around 1472 in the floor of the Badia's church, not too far from Pandolfini's slab. It would come to have upwards of 100 family members buried underneath it. And one more, great. Happenstance tells us that the famed bookseller Vespasiano da Bisticci was buried under the effigy of his brother Jacopo in Santa Croce on July 27, 1498. Exploration of city burial records and the Books of the Dead from other churches will likely show us that far from the cult of an individual, effigy tombs could and did serve Florentines as family sepulchres, though not for eternity, as their users would have liked. Thank you.